So you'll recall in the part 1 of our Judge Dredd series, we discussed one comic that was many seen as kind of the best Judge Dredd story ever written. And that story is America, written by John Wagner.
John Wagner, of course, is the most prolific Judge Dredd director of them all, and the co-creator of the character.
Having this as an introductory comic, actually I cheated a little bit and started reading The Pit first. But America, just as a comic in general, what's really interesting about this comic is it's tied into a major character like Judge Dredd, but it actually, as a standalone comic, is terrific. I'm sure I've seen the movies and I know about Judge Dredd on some level, read a comic here and there, but I felt like if I had known absolutely nothing about Judge Dredd, this comic would be the perfect primer to the Judge Dredd universe. But we can get into that more later. I can see why a lot of people would call this just kind of a masterpiece comic. I mean, I really enjoyed this in all its oddities and all its terror and just the world it built.
Yeah, it's a really memorable story for many different reasons. Do you like to go into why you like the comic?
Yeah, absolutely. I think my favorite part of the comic, legitimately, was just that it was told from the perspective of a normal guy. I mean, not really necessarily. I mean, as time goes on, he gets farther and farther from normal, but he just starts as like a typical kid. So they were very smart in the way they wound that up. Everybody kind of remembers their childhood and what that was like. And so they kind of introduce you to the harsh reality of Mega City 1 via Bennett Beanie, who is, he's just kind of your typical, I think, kind of lower class kid dealing with bullies. Through this confrontation with bullies, he encounters a judge. And this judge, we basically see right away, it doesn't matter that he was the target of these bullies. All that this judge sees is that he was in a fight. We all kind of know what that's like to be unfairly targeted by an authority figure. And so looping you in through this sympathetic character, such a great move. Perspective of the comic is really my favorite element of the comic, even though it's not told from the perspective of Judge Dredd, despite being a Judge Dredd story in some sense. So there's also probably the main character in the comic, though the comic is not told from her perspective, is America, who's a friend of Bennett. And I was a little bit put off at first by the fact that they straight out called the character America, but they dovetailed that in nicely with the fact that her father was very excited to be in America. He was an immigrant from the southern wastes, I believe. Maybe you know more about that area of the world in this universe.
Essentially, he's a Mexican.
The Judge Dredd version of a Mexican, which was interesting because I didn't even realize they dealt with that region of the world in this comic, in this universe. But he's very excited about what America represents. This is like the historical image of America that a lot of immigrants have in their head, I think, which is that maybe not the streets are literally paved with gold, but figuratively, there's lots of opportunities, plenty of chances to become prosperous and live in a good place, which of course, major discussion in American society and around the world is the truth of those statements. But in any case, that's the impression that at some point had been spread around the world. And so that's how you wind up with the character America. She's the descendant of these folks. And it's all about her struggle to actually fight the rule of the judges in this society. We see right away that especially through Bennett's experience with a judge. I mean, that's just the introduction, but it only goes up from there, is that the populace is in constant terror. They're not free at all. And what we see is that the judges, more than actually caring about enforcing justice and the law, like legitimate law, what they are really interested in is enforcing order. Now, I'm sure there are laws that are structured to do that for them, but they tend to be on the harsh side, and the judges really aren't into second chances. I mean, you do the crime, you do the time. I mean, they're constantly threatening people with jail time and threatening family members and just to ruin your life, basically. I mean, they may not be taking somebody out in the street and executing them, but in this world we see, and just as it would be in the real world, that going to jail is a huge impediment to just freedom in general. So
it's very interesting that you say impediment, because one of the recurring themes of the comics is that there's no real evolution or development of society. The judges just contain society. They contain the status quo, but they squash anything that can threaten their power or change society in any way that they are not in control of. So it's all about control and order on their terms.
And of course, the natural reaction to that by America, actually a whole group of her new pals.
There are many different factions of pro-democracy groups, but the one that she represents is called Total War.
Right.
And they will be a recurring group later on in Judge Dredd series. They're going to be a major pain in the ass for the Department of Justice.
Once that rebellion swings into full motion, I mean, you see Bennett's life change completely. I mean, he finds success because he's willing to kind of live within the confines of what the judges are offering society. He wants to, he has a good singing voice, he's funny, he becomes a celebrity, and he gets lots of money, and he goes off and kind of just lives in, figuratively speaking, the clouds just to enjoy life and all of what it has to offer. He's kind of admittedly had to leave America behind at this point, the character America, because she's gone off with Total War to fight against the judges. Finally, and I would warn anybody listening to this, certainly spoilers, Bennett's reintroduction to her as an adult is when she's actually taking part in a plot to assassinate judges. This becomes the swing event that sets up the rest of the comic and the conclusion it ultimately spirals into. So one element of this that I have to point out, as long as we're talking about the rule of the judges, I love this cartoon they threw in the middle of Judge Pal. Do you remember Judge Pal?
Absolutely. Judge Pal also appears in several other of the comics, and those stories featuring Judge Pal are really interesting, and I recommend that you read them at one point. Suffice to say that the judge appointed to be Judge Pal does not have a pleasant job. However, it's really important for propaganda purposes, and that's the interesting thing here. That here you then have a propaganda outlet that targets children and targets the young, and essentially encourages them to just tell what all their friends and family are doing.
Right.
So in Nazi Germany, get them while they're young.
To get young, impressionable minds just to rat everybody else out. It's kind of an interesting throwback to children's programming, even in modern times. And just to see that being used in such a sinister fashion, it's an incredible moment, really. The story winds up, I don't want to leave too many spoilers for how the comic ends, but, unfortunately, it's kind of unavoidable when you talk about the trail that the character Bennett takes, which is to say that through the circumstances presented in the comic, he actually gets his mind swapped into America's body at the end of the comic. It was a little confusing to me. They show a snippet of it before the event actually happens, but before chronologically they lead to that moment. It's quite startling to realize that because he feels so bad about what happened, because ultimately he takes the Judge Pal route, and he kind of, in an effort to try and stop harm from befalling others, he turns in America. And but through the circumstances that occur, he takes over her body. He still remains a celebrity, but it's just what he sings about it's not funny anymore. I mean, the song at the end, he basically tells the audience exactly what's going on. Goes from wanting to actually entertain to kind of wanting to warn everybody in a way, as if they couldn't see what was going on around them. But that becomes his passion.
Sometimes you need someone to point out the obvious.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that's the role he takes on. This was kind of startling, and I almost wonder how people in 1990 would have felt about this comic. But certainly today, I think we see a lot of this kind of idea in the recent news story about Bruce Jenner becoming Caitlyn Jenner. I wonder thematically how linked they are. What do you think?
I actually think that is really interesting, and we've seen this many times before in Judge Dredd. When the comics were written back in the day, they really exaggerated things by taking the current trends at the time and extrapolating them to their logical extreme. And that's what they did with this, and that's what they've done with many other things. Like, for instance, in Mega City 1, sugar is illegal. That is a contraband, because sugar is bad for you, let alone tobacco. However, there are many of the things that they have satirized and taken to their logical extreme that reality since has caught up on, and in some cases even exceeded. And that is something that we see here too in the case of Bruce Jenner. Now, I know it's not exactly the same, but you have a similar theme where you then have someone who used to be an athlete and then became kind of an entertainer and then found a cause, the transgender cause, and became all about it, became a symbol of it. And in some ways, that is not wholly unlike what was up with Bennett.
Ultimately, this comic, I just felt this was tremendous. I mean, yeah, it does veer a little into the strange, a little into the odd, but if that's par for the course for Judge Dredd, then I think it's an excellent representation. And I just, even as somebody who doesn't typically read that comic, I just thought this was beautifully done. Just a wonderful story told from start to finish.
America is one of the stories that are very often recommended as a primer to Judge Dredd. However, there are also those who feels that America loses its impact if you're not familiar with at least some of the comics from before. How do you feel about that, now having read it?
It definitely paints a picture of the universe. I think that's the most interesting part to me. I mean, this perfectly explains everything as far as how the judges go, since they're kind of the front and center imagery for the entire comic, for all the Judge Dredd appearances. Almost the best imaginable crash course you could get, and it may be a little twisted, I guess, to be introduced to Judge Dredd as a villain, because in this story, he's only in it for, I don't know, a dozen pages or so, but he's definitely like the villain of the story. There's a point where Bennett's in the hospital, he's laid up because of a major injury he's sustained, and despite this horrific injury, Judge Dredd badgers him thoroughly and just essentially just doesn't care about him as a human being. I mean, there may be a very minor amount of empathy, but it's so minor it's almost undetectable. So being introduced to the hero, sort of the hero of your comics, as a villain, maybe that just opens the door for a wider interpretation of comic characters and why we're fascinated with them. So I'm going to have to side with the folks who say that this is a good introduction to the Judge Dredd comics.
One more thing. Would you like to see how this story continues to unfold in comics forward? Would you be interested in reading more Judge Dredd after this?
Absolutely. Especially this particular storyline, and I do understand that there are a couple of sequel comics to it.
Absolutely, is going to have a major impact. First and foremost, you have the Total War storyline, which is going to create havoc later on, but then it's also America Bennett, the shared daughter of America and Bennett. Because essentially what happens is that America is pregnant, and she gets a daughter, and the daughter Bennett names America Bennett. And due to circumstances we need not go into here, he signs her up with the Academy of Law, so she eventually becomes a judge, with the hope of changing the institution from inside, and she eventually becomes part of the inner circle with Judge Dredd himself.
So Judge Dredd, in a way, created her.
He had hand in her creation.
So yeah, knowing that especially, I mean, I am definitely interested in getting more into this, and I can't recommend America enough to folks who are only peripherally familiar with Judge Dredd, or even if you're familiar with the movies. I think this is just a really excellent transitional piece to move from the movies, which tend to be, focus on Dredd as an action hero, and sort of expand your view a little bit. If you liked this video, don't forget to hit subscribe so you can catch all of our upcoming videos. For more podcasts, news, and reviews, check us out at midnightsedge.net and follow us on Twitter at midnightsedge. Also check out our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/midnightsedge.